Welcome back to the panel discussion, Exfiltration in Government, Designing an Insider Threat Program, sponsored by Nuix on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Our guests today, Andy Castor, the Deputy Associate Deputy Director for the FBI, Patty Larson, the Co-Director of the National Insider Threat Task Force, and Keith Lowery, the Senior Vice President for Business Threat Intelligence and Analysis Team at Nuix. So before break, we did a little bit of a cliffhanger, not a who shot JR, don't worry, we don't do that here, but I said there's one person you missed, or one set of group you missed, Andy, from that group of executive committee. And what occurred to me was you mentioned it, but you didn't say they're part of it, which is contractors. Because as we know at FBI, at most agencies, the contractor workforce is if not a majority of the workforce, they're at least a strong 50%. So where do contractors fit in with the FBI?
Well, they're certainly not 50% at the FBI, but they are part of the FBI's cadre of people that help us function. But I will tell you this, that we look at the contractors right up there very similar or exactly the way we do it as our own employees. So they are, that board does look at, that we established does look at contractors. We look at them exactly the way we do as our own employees.
Is there any representation, or how does that work? It may be hard.
So our security division tracks our contractors, and of course our finance division, obviously procures those contracted services. So they're all part of the process, but we look at them very similar to our employees.
I know it's a difficult thing because they are, there's that whole one and the same. The other piece that we should talk to is the privacy people, the civil liberties people. I know you mentioned those as part of the group. Let me turn to Patty, though. This piece is so important. I think it's getting more important because there are concerns. We see it in Congress with legislation around cybersecurity, or just the whole security clearance issue now, unfortunately, the big massive data hack. Talk about the role of the privacy and civil liberties people.
Absolutely. If you look at the amount of information that your insider threat team has access to, it's a fairly sensitive amount of information, and it's about their own colleagues. It's not about the adversary. They're not all-source intelligence analysts. They're looking at their friends, their coworkers. And so they have to be well-trained on how to protect that information, what they're allowed to retain, for how long, and how they use it. And they have to partner with the civil liberties and privacy communities who are experts at things like systems of records notices, SORNs, who can provide them information about data retention, who can say how certain pieces of data should or should not be used. And these are all incredibly important because if the workforce feels like this program is not here to help them, but it's here to spy on them, it will never succeed.
I think that's a key point. If it feels like it's against them, not for them, you have bigger problems. How do you, from the Insider Threat Task Force, work with agencies to say, hey, don't forget your chief privacy officer, are they involved? Or, hey, don't forget, is the general counsel involved in some way?
So it's written into the executive order and the national policy. It's actually part of the minimum standards as well that calls for departments and agencies to incorporate legal and civil liberty and privacy concerns right up front. We engage with those communities as well in different forums. We've got one actually coming up the end of this month to bring together legal counsels and the civil liberties and privacy folks and have them talk among themselves about what they're seeing in their agencies, what the challenges are, and how they can come up with some consistent guidance. Because it's very important that each agency hears something consistent from their advisors, or else we don't have an even program across the government.
I want to turn to Keith in a second, but one last question on this piece. There's a lot of good government groups, a lot of experts in the private sector who focus on privacy and civil liberties. Do they play a role in this too? Do you ask them for what are the best practices in the community? I know, Keith, you may be going there too, so let me go to Patty first.
Sure. No, we absolutely work with anybody who's got some insights into some of the privacy challenges because the government has a certain set of rules in how we operate, but we also do business with a lot of companies, and industry is building the things that the government uses. So we have to be aware of what their privacy challenges are and what their best practices are as well.
She opened the door, walked through it. What's the privacy challenges? What should we know about what the private sector faces too? And
the private sector faces the exact same challenges, except they're even more amplified because within the federal government, you only have basically one taskmaster. But when you're talking about
535 of them, I don't know. You forgot about the, keep going.
But in the commercial world, geopolitical boundaries, every state has different regulations that have to be monitored and adhered to. Plus, when you have corporations that go multi or internationally, you have varying rules and regulations about privacy and civil liberties that go across individual countries. And so what you discover in one country in some circumstances, are prevented from being shared with the same company that works in a different country. So it's imperative that you have the stakeholders include general counsel, civil liberties, privacy, and any other stakeholders that are pertinent to the information that's being discussed.
Andy.
I think at the FBI, I think the privacy of our data is number one. We legally obtain a large amount of information at the FBI for investigations, whether that's through court orders or subpoenas. And I think the American taxpayer depends on us to safely store that information in a way that it isn't leaked out. There's always allegations against people which are not true. That's part of our job. And if we didn't properly secure that information, whether that's an insider threat, somebody could illegally, whether it's wittingly or unwittingly, release that information, would have a detrimental effect on that person. So I think the taxpayer depends on us to do the right thing.
And I think that's a key point you're bringing up is it's not so much for us, it's the perception. And I know, Patty, talk a little bit about that perception issue because of all the things that have happened over the years, all the different incidents. Is that what's different now with insider threat? Because this concept, this idea of insider threat is not new. We know that.
Absolutely. We've been doing this for a very long time, but what we didn't do very well was to bring together information from various stovepipes in an organization to try to be more proactive. So we are very good at following the breadcrumbs after a crisis happens and reconstructing what happened and how somebody committed some act. What we need to do much better at, and Keith mentioned 180 days for cyber attacks. We've got statistics on spy cases post-Cold War that are over decades. We can't afford to have somebody have access that long and cause that much damage. So what we need to do is bring together information in a proactive way up front. So you might identify somebody before it becomes too much of a problem, and that's what's different today.
When we talk about bringing information in a proactive way, let me turn to Keith on this one. There's so much information out there. It's finding the needle in the haystack, but it also could be the needle in the pile of needles that's in the haystack. How can technology and other tools make things easier?
Well, the way we approach it, that we teach our commercial clients, is that, again, it starts with narrowing down the scope of what it is you're trying to protect. And so that comes back to identifying what that critical value data is. And, we can call it crown jewels or you can call it whatever you'd like. But if you focus your energy on protecting those things that need to be protected, you don't have to look at the entire globe because data is infinite. And if you spend your time trying to look through infinite amount of data, you will be looking for that needle in the proverbial haystack, not even knowing where the haystack is. So we, first of all, focus on that critical value data. The second thing that we do is teach corporations to do exactly as Patty and Andy have said, which is to have and create an organization that's headed, that has that advocacy from the senior executive, that has an appointed senior person who can cross over all of the internal boundaries to make sure that they gather information as it's needed. And then we use a program to be able to cull through that finite data and be able to identify activities much quicker than 180 days or 200 days or 10 years or how many decades somebody's in there doing it.
One of the things that Keith talked about was the critical data, the crown jewels. Andy, from your perspective, how do you do that from the FBI? Because everything's great. Everything is wonderful. Maybe not your email to your wife saying I'll be home late, but...
Well, I think that's a great question. Keith kind of talked about it a little bit here, but I think one of the things we did an internal study, a very extensive internal study. What are those networks? What are those databases? What is that information that we obtain, have in our systems? How is it kept? How is it protected? Everything is not equal. It's a risk-based. It's no different than you are in the private sector. There's a risk-based approach. What are the most critical things that would have that the American taxpayer, that would affect our brand? People expect certain things from the FBI, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to meet those expectations. So we have a risk-based approach. We look at what are those items. You rack and stack them, and then we analyze what are the best approach to protect those assets.
Do you get to the point where there's still too many? I mean, because you're never going to get down to top 10 list.
I don't know if there's too many. There's depending on the risk, there's minimal. You can do minimal things to protect data. It's not necessarily like you see on TV where you have to do this, have lasers and everything protecting everything.
That'd be cool if you did, though.
Yeah,
maybe.
some things are is maybe even in paper format. Everything's not electronic still, believe it or not. Companies, outside entities, and the government still has paper. Having things locked up and accessibility by a few people may suffice to some degree.
Patty.
It's important, too, to remember that the things that are most important aren't always those things that are classified. The scope of the executive order was originally scoped to classified information because that was the challenge we were trying to address. But we realize in working with the rest of the government and with industry that a lot of their crown jewels are things that are totally unclassified, but if some damage was caused, we would have a significant problem in national or economic security. So look at student loan databases. Look at the amount of money that flows in and out of those databases. Look at the Social Security Administration. These aren't classified pieces of information, but if those flows are disrupted, that causes damage to all of us. So it's important to realize it's not simply things that are marked classified that are important.
How is the Insider Threat Task Force getting that message to agencies that, yes, we talk about classified in the executive order, but you have to be, again, go back to something that Andy said earlier on, how to be more broad.
We talk to them and say that a lot of the protection measures you put in place for your classified side is also going to take care of your unclassified side. So take a broad approach, as Andy and Keith have talked about, figure out what's important, and what we've seen many agencies do actually is focus on their unclassified information first.
Keith?
And it's interesting that both of what they've said is exactly true. What we teach corporations to do is look and prioritize, because you could have 200 separate databases that are crown jewels, but you still have to prioritize and whittle away at them one by one. But it's also interesting to note that unless you get the stakeholders together who can defend why something is important to them, another stakeholder would say, no, what you have is meaningless, what we have is really important. By getting them together, you're able to prioritize in a very eloquent way. And just think about it, there was a company recently whose executive emails were distributed on the net, and that caused the CEO to lose their job. So I wonder if beforehand, if they considered the executive emails to be a piece of critical value data, and if they had gone through the stakeholders, maybe they would have decided that was.
So, Andy, talk a little bit about when you guys did that internal review, when you looked at the data and said what's most important, what's second, what's third. When you brought that executive committee together to talk about insider threat, what was the, generally speaking, discussions like? Did people, was there kind of make your case and Director Comey decides what's the highest priority? Like, how does the process work?
No, I think one of the things too is everybody always thinks they know what's important, because if it's in your area of expertise, that's the most important thing to you. I think once you sit down in a group and you're all together and you have what it is all those lists in front of you of what, if you want to call them assets or crown jewels, as Keith said, once you start looking at them, it becomes pretty evident how to rack and stack them. If you're thinking about it objectively in a logical manner, everybody talks about it, and it's a good discussion, but I don't think anybody really sways from what they think are the important ones, and it's easy to rack and stack. At least if you're looking at top 10's pretty easy. Maybe if you hit top 25, there might be a little bit of a disagreement, onesie, twosie, but pretty much they're all pretty much in line of what most people expect.
Keith, do you find that in the private sector as well?
I do, and in fact, one of the key benefits of doing the racking and stacking is that once you put in place that insider threat program, that holistic approach, what you've learned from the top priorities makes the bottom tier much easier to incorporate into the program, because you have all these lessons learned that you can incorporate into that program.
Patty, from the task force perspective, what is being done from there's multiple pieces going on at once. What is being done from a policy, from a procedures, from a technology? Each agency is not on an island, but they have a set of standards they're following. Talk a little bit about the process to rack and stack their data, the process to, okay, then once we do that, how do we apply the classified protections maybe to the unclassified side? How's that process working today?
Right. So you mentioned that the policy underpinnings really are from 4 years ago, but we've encountered a lot of specific questions as agencies have built out a program, and they want to know how to tackle specific things. So what we've tried to do is give them amplifying guidance since the executive order and policy came out that says, here's how you tackle specific pieces of the program. A lot of them are legal or policy questions. What we found often is that it's not technology that's the issue. So technical constraints aren't the thing that they're trying to wrestle with. They need the resources to buy the technology, but it really is, how can I tackle the legal issues, or I need a policy on this. So we're trying to give out that amplifying guidance so they have what they need in place.
Is this the type of thing where you're updating it every 6 months, every year, based on the questions? Is it a set of frequently asked questions to simplify it?
We put out some advisories or directives to the community that says, a lot of you have had this particular issue. Let's talk about things like data mining. Let's talk about data retention issues. So those are specific guidance documents that go out. We also have a lot of forums where people talk about issues, and they may not realize that they are one of many who is all facing the same thing. So it's good to get them together and to talk about it.
And I think that's the key. A lot of people, when you kind of take away what the FBI does versus what another agency does, you're all dealing with the same type of challenges. I mean, Andy, is that something you guys are, Justice Department's a big agency, FBI is the big bureau within the Justice. Do you find you talk with your other counterparts within Justice, within maybe Treasury or DHS or DHS as well, about best practices? How's that discussion happening?
So I think it's a constantly evolving. I think once you set up a program, whether it's insider threat program or another program, you can't rest on your laurels. So if once you think that you're the expert on it, then you've already lost in the game. So one of the things, like I said, when we did, I hate to bring up that we did a study, we went out and benchmarked. We not only benchmarked with other agencies, but we went out to the private sector and see how they benchmarked by sector. And it was very revealing. And there's a lot of best practices out there. Some fit us, some don't. There's some, we have legal restrictions that maybe the private sector doesn't. Some things that are important to them are not important to us. But, the key things, but it's still the same process, and you learn from it, and you learn to evolve. I think that's the key.
All right. Good time to take a break. We're going to come back. We can talk about where we're going next with Insider Threat. You're listening to the panel discussion, Exfiltration and the Government, Designing an Insider Threat Program, sponsored by Nuix on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.